There is a particular quality of light in Warsaw in late autumn, cold, flat, and unsparing, that seems to press down upon the city like a hand upon a shoulder, reminding everything beneath it of its own weight. It is under this light, in the final decades of the 19th century, that one of the most consequential scientific minds in human history first learned to think in secret. The city that shaped Maria Skłodowska was not a free city. Warsaw in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s existed as a subject territory within the Russian Empire, its streets patrolled by imperial authority, its language suppressed in public institutions, its intellectual life forced underground by a regime that understood, correctly, that education was the most dangerous form of resistance available to a conquered people. The cobblestone streets that wound through the city's older districts bore the architectural grammar of a place that had known grandeur and been made to forget it. Neoclassical facades, weathered to the color of old bone, their ornamental details still legible beneath decades of coal smoke and neglect. The bureaucratic insignia of Russian imperial administration affixed to doorways that had once opened onto Polish civic life. The Vistula River moved through the city with the slow, indifferent authority of geography, dark and heavy beneath iron bridges that collected early frost on their structural members. The fog rolling off the water in the pre-dawn hours to fill the lower streets with a cold, diffuse luminescence that softened the hard edges of the city's occupation without diminishing its reality. Gas lamps stood at intervals along the major thoroughfares, their amber halos barely penetrating the autumn fog, islands of warm light in a landscape of institutional grey. It was into this city, in November of 1867, that Maria Skłodowska was born, the fifth and youngest child of W. Ladislaw Skłodowski, a teacher of physics and mathematics, and Bronislawa Skłodowska, a pianist and educator who ran a prestigious Warsaw boarding school for girls. The family's apartment on Freta Street, and later on Nowogrodzka Street, embodied the particular domestic character of Warsaw's educated middle class under occupation. Rooms crowded with books, scientific instruments, and handwritten correspondence, where the physical evidence of intellectual life was simultaneously a source of pride and a potential liability. Polish language texts were concealed beneath Russian-approved volumes on shelves visible from the doorway. Scientific instruments were positioned to appear as decorative objects to the casual observer. The apartment's walls absorbed the competing pressures of a family that valued knowledge above almost everything else and lived in a political environment that treated certain kinds of knowledge as criminal. The Skłodowski household was shaped by loss as much as by learning. Maria's mother, Bronislawa, died of tuberculosis in 1878 when Maria was 10 years old, a death that followed years of illness during which the family's financial circumstances deteriorated steadily. Her eldest sister Zofia had died 2 years earlier of typhus. These losses did not diminish the family's commitment to education. If anything, they intensified it, as though knowledge were a form of preservation against the attrition of circumstance. W. Ladislaw Skłodowski continued to teach, continued to bring scientific instruments home from the school where he worked, continued to read aloud to his children from texts that represented the accumulated inheritance of European scientific thought. The physical environment of Maria's childhood education was thus a layered one. The official curriculum of Russian-administered schools on one surface, and beneath it the richer, more dangerous curriculum of a household where intellectual curiosity was treated as a moral obligation. She excelled in the official system with a consistency that drew attention and awards, completing her secondary education with a gold medal in 1883. But the education that mattered most was conducted in smaller, more intimate spaces. The family parlor in the evenings, the cramped study where her father's scientific instruments were arranged with the care of a man who understood their value, the kitchen table where mathematical problems were worked through by lamplight after the official school day had ended. Beyond the Skłodowski apartment, Warsaw's intellectual resistance to Russian occupation had organized itself into a remarkable clandestine institution known as the Floating University, a network of secret educational gatherings that moved through private apartments, back rooms, and concealed spaces across the city, offering the kind of rigorous academic instruction that Russian authorities had deliberately withheld from Polish women and from Polish language education more broadly. The name was both descriptive and metaphorical. The university floated because it had no fixed address, no permanent location that could be raided and shut down, no single point of vulnerability that the imperial administration could target. It existed in motion, in the spaces between official surveillance, in the gap between what the occupation permitted and what the occupied people refused to surrender. The physical spaces that hosted these gatherings were chosen for their ordinariness, the domestic and commercial environments of everyday Warsaw life that would attract no special attention from the authorities. A seamstress's back room where scientific texts were stacked beneath bolts of fabric. A music teacher's parlor where mathematical notation filled the margins of sheet music. A merchant's storage cellar where chemistry equipment was concealed behind barrels of grain. These spaces shared a common visual grammar, the surface appearance of ordinary activity, and beneath it, the hidden intellectual world that Warsaw's educated class refused to abandon. Maria Skłodowska participated in these gatherings from her late teens, attending sessions on natural science, sociology, and anatomy in the cramped, candlelit apartments of women who had organized this underground institution with the methodical determination of people who understood that what they were doing was both illegal and essential. The physical atmosphere of these gatherings, walls lined floor to ceiling with forbidden literature, the warm flicker of tallow candles against cold plaster walls, chalk dust drifting through narrow beams of light from shuttered windows, represented something more than mere education. It was the physical enactment of a refusal, the refusal to accept that the boundaries drawn by imperial authority around the life of the mind were legitimate or permanent. The arrangement Maria eventually made with her sister Bronislawa, that each would support the other's education in turn, Maria working as a governess to fund Bronislawa's medical studies in Paris before Bronislawa reciprocated, was itself a product of this environment of constrained possibility and creative resistance. The years Maria spent as a governess in the countryside north of Warsaw, in the flat agricultural landscape of the Mazovian plain, where winter arrived early and stayed long, were years of intellectual isolation compensated by intense private study. She wrote to her brother Joseph of her determination to continue learning, of the scientific texts she worked through alone in the evenings, of her conviction that the education she was accumulating in secret would eventually find its proper expression in a world larger than the one available to her in Russian-controlled Poland. The Warsaw she returned to between governess positions was a city in which the blue-white light of scientific possibility existed only in hidden rooms, in the concealed instruments of a suppressed culture, in the patient accumulation of knowledge that had nowhere yet to go. The cold steel blues of the city's winter skies pressed down on cobblestones slicked with rain, on the amber halos of gas lamps barely holding back the fog from the Vistula, on the grand but weathered facades of a city that had been made to carry the weight of someone else's authority. But in the small, warm, candlelit rooms where Warsaw's intellectual life persisted against every institutional effort to extinguish it, something was being prepared. A mind of extraordinary precision and endurance, shaped by suppression into a form that suppression itself could not have anticipated, ready for the moment when the grey skies of occupation would give way to the different, more complex light of a larger world. To understand what the floating university was, one must first understand what it replaced and what its absence would have meant. In Russian-controlled Warsaw during the final decades of the 19th century, the University of Warsaw refused admission to women without exception. The official educational infrastructure of the occupation was designed not merely to instruct, but to contain, to define the boundaries of permissible thought along lines of both nationality and gender. What the floating university represented, in its most essential form, was the organized refusal of those boundaries by people who understood that knowledge, once kindled, cannot be administratively extinguished. The network operated on a principle of deliberate impermanence. No single location served as its center. No fixed address could be raided, no permanent classroom shuttered by imperial decree. Instead, the gatherings rotated through a shifting constellation of private apartments and concealed commercial spaces across Warsaw's residential districts. Moving on schedules communicated through trusted intermediaries, the location of each session known only to those who needed to know it. The name, the Floating University, or in Polish, the Latejsi Uniwersytet, captured both the practical mechanism of its survival and something of its philosophical character, an institution that existed in motion, that derived its resilience precisely from its refusal to be fixed in place. The spaces that hosted these sessions were chosen for their capacity to conceal intellectual activity within the visual grammar of ordinary life. A seamstress's back room presented to any observer the unremarkable surface of a working trade establishment. Bolts of fabric stacked against the walls, a cutting table positioned near the window for natural light, the tools of the dressmaker's craft arranged in plain view. But beneath those bolts of fabric, scientific texts were stored in careful sequence, their spines turned inward, their titles invisible to anyone who did not already know they were there. When the session began, the fabric was moved aside, the texts were distributed, and the back room became a laboratory of the mind operating under the cover of commerce. A music teacher's parlor offered different concealment. Sheet music was a socially acceptable object in any bourgeois Warsaw household, stacked on the piano, spread across the music stand, piled on chairs and side tables without attracting comment. Mathematical notation filled the margins of these scores in a hand indistinguishable, at a glance, from musical annotation. The parlor's piano served its legitimate function for students during daylight hours, and then, in the evenings, the same space reorganized itself around a different kind of instruction. The sheet music, open to reveal the mathematical problems worked between the staves. Lamplight falling across the faces of young women, bent over calculations that the official educational system had declared beyond their proper concern. Perhaps the most extraordinary of these concealed spaces was the merchant's storage cellar that served periodically as a chemistry classroom. The cellar's surface identity was entirely convincing. Barrels of grain stacked in the practical arrangement of a working storage facility, the smell of dry wood and dusty stone, the low ceiling and narrow entrance that discouraged casual inspection. Behind those barrels, chemistry equipment was stored with the methodical care of people who understood its value and its danger. Glass retorts wrapped in cloth, copper tubing coiled and labeled, small quantities of chemical reagents in sealed containers, the basic apparatus of scientific inquiry reduced to its most portable and concealable essentials. When a session was scheduled, the barrels were moved, the equipment was assembled on rough wooden tables, and the cellar became a space where the fundamental processes of chemical transformation were demonstrated and discussed by candlelight, the flame of each candle serving simultaneously as light source and as the most basic instrument of combustion chemistry. The visual language of these spaces was one of perpetual double identity. Every drawer that slid open to reveal a forbidden textbook had also, moments before, appeared to contain nothing more remarkable than household accounts or trade correspondence. Every floorboard lifted to expose a hidden cache of scientific correspondence had, from above, been indistinguishable from the surrounding floor. The lamplight that illuminated faces bent over scientific diagrams in stolen hours was the same lamplight that, to any observer at the window, suggested nothing more than an ordinary evening gathering of women engaged in the socially acceptable activities of needlework or musical practice. The participants in these gatherings understood the risk they were accepting. Russian imperial authorities treated unauthorized educational activity as a form of political resistance, which, of course, it was. The floating university's mission, as the scholar Naomi Pasachov has described it, was explicitly patriotic, to bring about Poland's eventual freedom by enlarging and strengthening its educated classes. The women who attended these sessions were not merely pursuing personal intellectual development. They were participating in a collective act of cultural preservation, maintaining the intellectual infrastructure of a nation that had been denied the institutional means to sustain it openly. Maria Skłodowska moved through this network in her late teens and early 20s, attending sessions on natural science, anatomy, and sociology in the apartments of women who had organized this underground institution with the quiet determination of people engaged in work they knew to be both dangerous and necessary. The physical experience of these gatherings left its mark on her understanding of what education could be, not the formal, hierarchical transmission of approved knowledge in purpose-built institutional spaces, but something more urgent and more intimate, conducted in the margins of official life, in the warm, candlelit rooms where Warsaw's intellectual culture persisted against every effort to suppress it. Beyond the individual spaces of instruction, the floating university was embedded in a wider urban geography of resistance. The city's churches served as meeting points where participants could exchange information under the cover of religious observance, their stone interiors offering the particular acoustic privacy of thick walls and high ceilings. The labyrinthine back alley networks connecting Warsaw's residential districts provided routes of movement that avoided the main thoroughfares where imperial surveillance was most concentrated. Along the Vistula riverbank at dawn, in the grey light before the city's official day began, documents were exchanged between individuals who passed each other without acknowledgement, the river's slow, dark movement providing both a backdrop and a kind of cover. Two figures pausing at the embankment wall were simply two people watching the water. Snow began to fall across Warsaw as the 1880s advanced, accumulating on cobblestones and windowsills with the patient, indifferent persistence of a natural process that recognized no political boundaries. The white accumulation on the city's surfaces functioned as both seasonal marker and visual metaphor. The slow, quiet layering of one thing upon another, each addition individually insignificant, the cumulative weight eventually transforming the character of the surface it covered. Knowledge in the floating university's hidden classrooms accumulated in precisely this way. One session at a time, one text at a time, one solved problem at a time, the individual increments imperceptible, but the cumulative effect profound. The floating university produced, over its years of operation, a generation of Polish women educated to a standard that the official system had deliberately withheld from them. It produced scientists, doctors, writers, and educators who carried the institution's intellectual inheritance into careers conducted, for the most part, outside Poland, in Paris, in Vienna, in other cities where women's access to formal education was less systematically obstructed. Maria Skłodowska was among the most consequential of these, though nothing about the back rooms and concealed cellars, where she first encountered rigorous scientific instruction, would have suggested the scale of what was being prepared there. What those spaces gave her was not merely knowledge, though the knowledge was real and substantial. They gave her a particular relationship to learning, an understanding of education as something worth risking for, worth organizing around, worth protecting from the forces that sought to prevent it. The scientific work she would later conduct in conditions of extraordinary material deprivation, in a leaking shed in Paris with inadequate equipment and no institutional support, drew on a resilience formed in these hidden Warsaw classrooms, where the first lesson learned was that the absence of proper facilities was not a reason to stop. The snow continued to fall on Warsaw's cobblestones, covering the traces of movement between safe houses, softening the hard edges of the occupation's architecture, accumulating on the windowsills of rooms where young women bent over forbidden texts by candlelight. Outside, the city presented its grey, compliant face to imperial authority. Inside, in the spaces between official surveillance, the slow, patient work of building a future continued, one hidden classroom at a time, one solved equation at a time, one young mind shaped by the extraordinary conviction that knowledge, however dangerous, was worth every cost required to obtain it. The railway journey from Warsaw to Paris in the early 1890s was not a matter of hours, but of days, a passage across the full breadth of Central Europe that unfolded as a slow, continuous transformation of landscape, light, and atmosphere, each successive region offering a visual grammar distinct from the one before it. For Maria Skłodowska, departing Warsaw in the autumn of 1891, at the age of 23, the journey represented something more than geographical transit. It was the physical enactment of a threshold crossing, the moment when the constrained intellectual world of occupied Poland gave way to the larger, more dangerous, more promising world that lay beyond its borders. The departure from Warsaw's railway station carried the particular emotional weight of a city releasing one of its own into circumstances it could not follow. The station's iron and glass architecture, a structure that belonged simultaneously to the industrial modernity of the late 19th century and to the imperial administrative apparatus that controlled movement in and out of Russian-controlled territory, framed the beginning of the journey in the cold steel blues that had defined the city's visual character throughout the preceding sequences. Steam rose from the locomotive in dense white columns that dissolved almost immediately into the grey autumn air, the platform's gas lamps casting there narrow amber halos across the faces of departing travellers, the cobblestones of the station forecourt slicked with the same autumn rain that had characterized Warsaw streets throughout the documentary's opening chapters. As the train moved westward out of the city, the urban density of Warsaw gave way gradually to the flat agricultural landscape of the Mazovian Plain, the same territory where Maria had spent years working as a governess, the same frost-hardened fields and low horizons that had formed the backdrop of her years of isolated private study. The color palette of these opening sequences of the journey maintained the cold steel blues of Warsaw, the landscape offering little visual warmth. Bare deciduous trees standing at intervals against a sky the color of old pewter, frozen furrows in dark soil, the occasional cluster of farm buildings rendered in the muted ochres and greys of weathered timber and unpainted plaster. The Vistula's tributary rivers appeared and disappeared at the edges of the frame, their surfaces reflecting the flat grey light of the overcast sky. The crossing into German-controlled territory brought the first subtle shifts in the landscape's visual character. The flat Polish plains began to yield, almost imperceptibly at first, to the gentle undulations of the German interior. Low hills appearing on the horizon, their slopes carrying the remnants of autumn foliage in muted golds and rusted browns that introduced the first warm tones into a palette that had been almost entirely cold. The architecture of the railway stations through which the train passed changed in character. The Russian imperial administrative style of Warsaw's infrastructure replaced by the more varied vernacular of German civic architecture, each station a small study in regional identity. The light remained flat and grey, the overcast sky a constant presence, but the quality of the grey itself was shifting, less the oppressive, pressing grey of Warsaw's occupation atmosphere, more the neutral, uncommitted grey of transitional weather. The Rhine Valley announced itself through a dramatic change in topography and vegetation. The vine-covered slopes that descended to the river's edge carried, even in late autumn with the harvest long completed, a visual richness that the Polish plains had not offered. The geometric precision of vineyard rows climbing the hillsides, the pale stone of riverside towns reflected in water that moved with more animation than the slow, dark Vistula. The color palette warmed further here, the ochres and oxidized greens of Findercycle Central European landscape beginning to assert themselves against the residual blues of the journey's Polish opening. The Rhine itself appeared as a presence of considerable visual authority, wide, grey-green, moving with the purposeful energy of a river that had shaped the geography and history of the continent through which it flowed. The approach to Paris through the city's industrial northern suburbs offered a different kind of visual transition, not the gradual, landscape-driven shift of the preceding hours, but a more abrupt encounter with the physical evidence of urban industrial modernity. Factory chimneys rose against the sky in clusters, their smoke adding a warm grey-brown haze to the atmosphere that softened the hard edges of the industrial architecture beneath them. Railway yards spread across the flat ground north of the city in vast, intricate networks of iron track and switching equipment, the scale of the infrastructure suggesting the enormous volume of movement, of goods, of people, of materials that the city required to sustain itself. The color palette of these suburban sequences occupied an intermediate zone between the cold blues of Poland and the warmer ochres of the city proper. A transitional register that prepared the eye for the visual world of Paris without yet fully delivering it. The arrival in Paris itself, at the Gare du Nord, the great iron and glass terminus that received the trains from the north and east, was an encounter with a scale of urban architecture that Warsaw, for all its neoclassical grandeur, had not prepared its travelers to expect. The station's vast interior, its iron vaulting rising to heights that dwarfed the individual human figure, its platforms crowded with the movement of thousands of people engaged in the ordinary business of arrival and departure, represented a different order of urban experience than anything the journey had passed through. The light inside the station was a complex mixture of natural illumination filtering through the glass roof panels and the artificial light of gas lamps positioned along the platforms. A warm, diffuse luminescence that softened the industrial hardness of the iron structure around it. Beyond the station, the city revealed itself in the full complexity of its Belle Epoque character. The wide horseman boulevards, those great surgical incisions, through the medieval urban fabric of the older city, completed in the preceding decades under Baron Horseman's direction, offered vistas of architectural coherence and civic ambition that were simultaneously impressive and slightly overwhelming in their scale and regularity. The ornate iron lampposts that lined these boulevards were already lit in the early evening, their warm light falling on the chestnut trees that bordered the pavements, on the elaborate facades of the apartment buildings whose uniform height and consistent architectural vocabulary gave the boulevards their characteristic visual rhythm. The Latin Quarter, where Maria Skłodowska would make her life as a student, occupied a different register entirely. The Fifth Arrondissement's narrow medieval streets, the streets that had survived Horseman's transformations largely intact, offered a visual world of intimate scale and accumulated historical texture that stood in deliberate contrast to the grand boulevards of the city's Horseman-era reconstruction. The streets of the Latin Quarter wound and narrowed in ways that reflected the organic growth of a medieval urban settlement rather than the geometric logic of 19th century urban planning. Their cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, their facades carrying the layered evidence of architectural interventions across multiple periods. The grand facade of the Sorbonne rising above the Place de la Sorbonne was the quarter's dominant architectural presence, a building whose institutional authority was legible in every detail of its construction, from the scale of its entrance portal to the precision of its stone carving. For a young woman who had received her serious scientific education in back rooms and concealed cellars, the physical reality of this institution, its permanence, its grandeur, its unapologetic assertion of intellectual authority in stone and mortar, must have carried an almost overwhelming significance. Against this grandeur, the garret rooms where students lived in deliberate austerity offered a study in productive poverty. A single room with a coal stove that barely functioned against the damp cold of Parisian winter, a mattress on a bare wooden floor, a window overlooking a narrow courtyard where pigeons gathered on frost-covered ledges, their grey forms moving against the pale stone of the courtyard walls in the flat winter light. Maria Skłodowska reportedly lived in conditions of such deliberate frugality during her early years in Paris that she sometimes fainted from cold and insufficient food. The physical cost of a student life conducted at the absolute margin of material subsistence. Yet these cramped, poorly heated rooms were also spaces of extraordinary intellectual possibility. The Latin Quarter had, for centuries, been the geography of European student life, the place where young minds from across the continent came to encounter the accumulated inheritance of Western learning in its most concentrated institutional form. Before her fame, before the Nobel Prizes, before the world knew her name, Marie Curie worked tirelessly here, in these narrow streets, in these inadequate rooms, in the libraries and laboratories of an institution that would simultaneously offer her everything she had come for and resist her at every turn. The blue-white possibility of what she was moving toward existed in these early Latin Quarter sequences only as potential, a light not yet kindled, waiting in the cold rooms and frost-covered courtyards of a city that did not yet know what it had received. There is a particular cruelty embedded in beautiful spaces that refuse to fully receive the people who enter them. A cruelty rendered all the more acute by the contrast between architectural generosity and institutional narrowness, between the soaring ambition of stone and glass and the small, defensive calculations of the human systems operating within them. The Sorbonne at the turn of the 20th century was, by any architectural measure, one of the most magnificent educational environments in the world. Its great lecture halls occupied the interior of a building whose history stretched back to the 13th century, though the structure that Marie Curie entered as a student in 1891 was largely the product of a comprehensive reconstruction completed in 1901. A rebuilding that had transformed the medieval collegiate complex into a monument of the French Third Republic's faith in secular education as the foundation of national life. The exterior presented to the Place de la Sorbonne a facade of considerable formal authority, rusticated stone at the base giving way to pilasters and arched windows on the upper floors, the whole composition crowned by a dome whose presence could be read from considerable distances across the Latin Quarter's roofline. Inside, the great amphitheater lecture halls were spaces of accumulated institutional gravity, the tiered wooden. Seating, worn smooth by generations of students who had occupied these benches before her, rose in steep semicircular ranks toward the back of each hall, the wood darkened by decades of contact with the hands and clothing of the thousands who had passed through. The surfaces of these benches bore the physical evidence of that passage, carved initials, ink stains, the particular polish that comes not from deliberate maintenance, but from the slow friction of human presence over long periods of time. These were not the surfaces of a space maintained for display. They were the surfaces of a space genuinely used, worn into their current character by the accumulated weight of intellectual labor conducted within them. The tall arched windows that lined the lateral walls of the lecture halls admitted the flat grey light of Parisian winter days in long, diffuse columns that fell across the tiered seating at low angles in the morning hours, illuminating the chalk dust that drifted through the air in slow, suspended clouds. This light, neither warm nor cold, neither harsh nor gentle, but simply the neutral, uncommitted light of a northern European winter day filtered through tall glass, was the characteristic illumination of the Sorbonne's interior life. It fell on blackboards covered in dense mathematical notation and chemical formulae, the chalk marks accumulating across the dark surface in the layered, palimpsestic record of multiple lectures, earlier equations partially erased and overwritten by later ones, the intellectual history of a semester compressed into the visual archaeology of a single blackboard surface. The smell of these spaces, chalk and old wood, the particular mustiness of rooms that had absorbed decades of human occupation, the faint chemical residue of demonstration experiments conducted at the front of the hall, was inseparable from their visual character. The lectern at the base of each amphitheater was positioned to give the speaker maximum visual authority over the assembled students. The architecture of the hall itself designed to concentrate attention downward toward the front, to render the figure at the lectern the inevitable focal point of every sightline in the room. This spatial arrangement was not neutral. It was a physical encoding of pedagogical hierarchy. the architecture making visible the institutional assumptions about who possessed knowledge and who received it. Marie Curie occupied these halls initially as one of a very small number of women permitted to attend lectures at the Sorbonne, a presence tolerated rather than welcomed, her existence in these spaces representing an anomaly that the institution had not yet fully decided how to process. The male students who filled the tiered benches around her brought to these spaces the easy confidence of people whose right to be present had never been questioned, whose intellectual ambitions had never been treated as inherently inappropriate. The contrast between that ease and the particular quality of attention required to be present in a space that had not been designed with one's presence in mind was itself a form of education, a lesson in the invisible architecture of institutional exclusion that no blackboard formula could capture. The more intimate environments of the Sorbonne's laboratories and reading rooms made this exclusion legible in architectural form. The laboratory benches assigned by rank and gender placed women researchers at the periphery of the working space, positions that offered less access to the central equipment, less proximity to the senior researchers whose attention and mentorship shaped a scientific career. The narrow doorways of certain restricted reading rooms were not narrow by accident. They were the physical residue of institutional decisions about who deserved access to which categories of knowledge, decisions made by men who had never been required to justify them and who experienced the existing arrangements as natural rather than constructed. The Bibliothèque Nationale, that vast repository of French intellectual life located on the Rue de Richelieu, offered a different spatial experience, one of overwhelming scale and carefully managed access. Its great reading room, with its high vaulted ceiling and the long rows of reading tables arranged beneath it, was a space whose architectural ambition was genuinely democratic in aspiration, if not always in practice. The natural light that fell through the reading rooms, high windows illuminated the bent heads of scholars working at the long tables in a quality of diffuse, even illumination that seemed designed to render all intellectual labor equally visible, equally legitimate. Yet even here, the systems of access, the catalogues, the request procedures, the gatekeeping functions performed by institutional staff encoded assumptions about who had legitimate scholarly purposes and who did not. The cafes of the Latin Quarter served as the informal extension of the Sorbonne's intellectual life into the public spaces of the city. Environments where the hierarchies of the lecture hall were partially dissolved by the democratic informality of tables and coffee cups, where ideas circulated alongside tobacco smoke and the particular animated energy of young people who believe, with the intensity characteristic of that life stage, that the problems they were working on were the most important problems in the world. The Café de la Sorbonne, the Café Procope, the smaller, less celebrated establishments on the side streets of the 5th arrondissement. These were spaces where scientific ideas moved between people who had not yet been sorted into the institutional categories that would later define their careers, where the flat grey light of the Parisian winter day gave way to the warmer, more amber illumination of gaslit interiors, and where the boundaries between disciplines and between social positions were temporarily more permeable than the formal spaces of the university permitted. The Luxembourg Gardens, a short walk from the Sorbonne through the streets of the Latin Quarter, represented yet another register of Parisian intellectual life. The public park as extension of the academic world, the space where the city's student population spilled out of institutional environments into the open air. In winter, the gardens presented a landscape of bare plane trees and gravel paths, the formal geometry of the French garden style rendered in the monochrome palette of the cold season. Grey gravel, grey sky, the dark grey-brown of leafless branches against the pale stone of the garden's balustrades and statuary. Students moved through these spaces between lectures, their breath visible in the cold air, their conversations carrying the particular urgency of people for whom ideas were not yet professional obligations, but genuine discoveries. It was in this full complexity of spaces, The grand lecture halls and the restricted reading rooms, the laboratory benches and the cafe tables, the formal gardens and the narrow medieval streets. That Marie Curie pursued her education at the Sorbonne with a discipline and intensity that her professors found remarkable. She completed her license in physics in 1893, finishing first in her class. A result that the institution's architectural hierarchies had done nothing to facilitate and everything to obstruct. The following year, she completed a second license in mathematics, finishing second. These achievements were accomplished in spaces that had not been designed to produce them, by a person whose presence in those spaces represented a daily negotiation with an institution that had not yet decided whether to fully acknowledge her right to be there. In 1911, that same institution, the Sorbonne, with its tiered wooden benches and its flat grey winter light, would witness a moment of extraordinary collective recognition. When Marie Curie delivered a lecture there that year, an audience of reportedly 3,000 men rose to their feet to applaud her. The architectural space that had once processed her presence as an anomaly now contained, in that standing ovation, the physical evidence of a reckoning. The institution's accumulated assumptions about knowledge and gender, confronted by the undeniable reality of what she had achieved within and despite them. The chalk dust still drifted through the columns of winter light. The blackboards still bore their dense mathematical notation, but the space itself had been altered, subtly and permanently, by the passage through it of a mind that its architecture had never anticipated and could not contain. In the history of scientific discovery, few spaces carry the weight of contradiction more completely than a leaking wooden shed. A structure so inadequate to its purpose that it seems, in retrospect, almost designed to make the work conducted within it impossible. That such a space became the site of one of the most consequential scientific achievements in human history is not incidental to the story of Marie Curie. It is, in many ways, the story itself. The shed on Rue Vauquelin in Paris's 5th arrondissement had been offered to Pierre and Marie Curie by the École de Physique et de Chimie Industrielles as a working laboratory space. An offer made not from generosity, but from institutional indifference, the school having no better use for a structure that a German physician visiting it in 1898 described as resembling a cross between a stable and a potato cellar. The building's deficiencies were not minor inconveniences, but fundamental structural failures. A glass roof that admitted rain and winter light in equal measure, the precipitation falling directly onto the workbenches and equipment below during storms, a dirt floor that transformed into mud during wet weather, the ground absorbing moisture until the entire working surface of the laboratory became a landscape of soft, yielding earth that made the precise placement of equipment a constant challenge. Wooden workbenches stained with years of chemical residue from whatever previous activities the space had hosted, their surfaces bearing the accumulated record of processes no longer identifiable. The cold was a persistent presence. In winter, the shed offered almost no protection against the Parisian temperatures that could drop well below freezing. The glass roof conducting cold as efficiently as it admitted rain, the thin wooden walls providing minimal insulation against the wind that moved through the 5th arrondissement streets. Pierre and Marie Curie worked in this space wearing their outdoor coats, their breath visible in the cold air, their fingers numbed by temperatures that made the precise manipulation of delicate scientific instruments a test of physical endurance as much as intellectual concentration. The coal stove that provided the shed's only heating was inadequate to the volume of the space and the severity of the winters, its warmth dissipating almost immediately into the cold air above it. Yet it was precisely in these conditions that a more comfortable institutional environment might have rendered unnecessary to endure, that the work of isolating polonium and radium was conducted between 1898 and 1902. The scale of the physical labor involved was extraordinary by any measure. Marie Curie's doctoral research had established that the mineral pitchblende contained radioactive elements in concentrations far exceeding what uranium alone could account for, a finding that pointed toward the existence of previously unknown elements. To isolate these elements in quantities sufficient for chemical characterization required the processing of enormous amounts of raw material. Tons of pitchblende ore, obtained from the uranium mines of Joachimsthal in Bohemia, were delivered to the courtyard of the shed and stacked in accumulating piles that grew through the months of 1898 and into the years that followed. The courtyard itself became an extension of the laboratory, an outdoor processing space where the initial stages of ore reduction were conducted in massive iron cauldrons positioned over open fires. The physical labor of this processing fell primarily on Maria Curie, who stirred the boiling ore mixtures with an iron rod for hours at a time, the chemical vapors rising from the reduction processes filling the air around her with acrid haze that caught in the throat and strung the eyes. The scale of this work, the sheer physical effort of processing material measured in tons to extract products measured in fractions of a gram, was something that the shed's inadequate facilities made more arduous at every stage. There was no mechanical assistance, no industrial infrastructure, no institutional support for work that was, in its physical demands, closer to industrial chemistry than to the laboratory science of the Sorbonne's well-equipped research facilities. Inside the shed, the workbenches bore the equipment of this processing in its more refined stages. Glass retorts and copper tubing through which chemical solutions were distilled and concentrated, crystallization vessels in which the products of successive purification cycles were allowed to precipitate, electrometers of Pierre Curie's own design that measured the ionizing radiation emitted by each fraction of the processed material. These instruments, precise, delicate, calibrated to detect phenomena at the very edge of measurability, existed in deliberate tension with the crude physical environment surrounding them. The dirt floor, the leaking roof, the chemical-stained workbenches. These were the conditions within which instruments of extraordinary sensitivity were operated, their readings recorded in the dense, methodical notebooks that Maria Curie maintained with the disciplined consistency of a scientist who understood that the record of the work was as important as the work itself. The notebooks themselves were objects of remarkable character, their pages covered in the dense, precise handwriting of a researcher who wasted nothing, not paper, not time, not a single observation that might prove relevant. Experimental parameters were recorded with meticulous completeness. The weight of material processed, the chemical reagents employed, the temperature of the reactions, the electrometer readings that tracked the radioactivity of each successive fraction. These pages, still radioactive to this day, and stored in lead-lined boxes in the Bibliothèque Nationale, represent the physical record of a process that unfolded across years of sustained, methodical labor in conditions that would have defeated a less determined investigator. The visual centerpiece of the shed story, the detail that transforms the narrative of material deprivation and physical endurance into something approaching the mythological, is the glow. As the purification process advanced through its successive stages, as the radioactive elements were concentrated from the diffuse presence they occupied in raw pitchblende into the increasingly pure fractions that accumulated in the shed's glass vessels, a phenomenon became visible that no previous scientific work had prepared anyone to witness. The purified fractions glowed. In the darkness of the shed at night, with the gas lamps extinguished, the glass vessels arranged on the workbenches emitted a soft, blue-white phosphorescent light, a luminescence that required no external illumination, that arose from within the material itself, that transformed the interior of the crude wooden shed into a space of extraordinary, otherworldly beauty. Maria Curie wrote of this phenomenon with a wonder that her characteristic scientific restraint could not entirely contain. She and Pierre would come to the shed in the evenings specifically to observe this light, standing in the darkness, watching the soft blue-white glow of dozens of small vessels arranged on the shelves and workbenches, their light reflecting off the glass roof panels above and off the chemical-stained surfaces of the workbenches below. The shed that was, by daylight, a study in institutional inadequacy and material deprivation, became, by this light, something else entirely. A space transfigured by the visible evidence of discovery, the crude physical environment rendered irrelevant by the extraordinary phenomenon it contained. This glow, the visual signature that threads through the entire documentary as its most persistent and resonant motif, appears here in its most elemental form. Not yet the refined, steady luminescence of pure samples in sealed vessels, not yet the controlled, studied phenomenon of the Institut du Radium's purpose-built laboratories, but something rawer and more immediate. The first sustained visibility of a force that had always been present in matter, but had never before been seen. The blue-white light falling on Marie Curie's face as she stood in the darkened shed carried within it both the triumph of discovery and the cost that discovery would eventually exact, though neither she nor Pierre could have known, in those moments of luminous wonder, what that cost would be. The seasons moved through the shed with a physical insistence that the work could not ignore. Winter brought the cold and the rain through the glass roof, the mud floor, the inadequate coal stove. Spring brought a different quality of light through the glass panels, warmer, more directional, the sun's angle changing as the months advanced, the shadows in the shed shifting in character from the flat, diffuse grey of winter to the more defined, warmer light of the longer days. Summer brought heat that transformed the shed's inadequate ventilation from a minor inconvenience into a genuine physical hardship. The chemical vapors from the processing work accumulating in the still air of the enclosed space. The iron cauldrons in the courtyard radiating heat into an already warm day. Through all these seasonal variations, the work continued with the methodical persistence that was Marie Curie's most fundamental scientific characteristic. By July 1898, the first new element had been isolated and named Polonium, named for the occupied homeland that Russian imperial authority had suppressed but could not erase. By December of the same year, the existence of a second new element had been announced to the French Academy of Sciences, Radium, the element whose name would become inseparable from Marie Curie's own. The actual isolation of pure radium metal, in quantities sufficient for precise atomic weight determination, required 4 more years of processing in the shed on Rue Vauquelin, 4 years of stirring boiling ore in the courtyard, of recording electrometer readings in meticulous notebooks, of standing in the darkened shed, watching the blue-white glow that confirmed, night after night, that the work was advancing toward its goal. The shed on Rue Vauquelin was, in the end, not merely a laboratory. It was a demonstration, conducted over years, in conditions of deliberate institutional neglect, by 2 scientists who had been offered inadequate facilities and had transformed them into the site of fundamental discovery. That the most important variable in scientific work is not the quality of the space, but the quality of the mind brought to it. The leaking glass roof, the mud floor, the chemical-stained workbenches, these were not obstacles overcome by exceptional circumstance. They were the conditions within which the work was done, and the work was done anyway. The blue-white glow that filled the shed at night was not diminished by the crudeness of the space that contained it. If anything, the contrast between the inadequacy of the vessel and the extraordinary nature of what it held made the light more remarkable, a luminescence that owed nothing to institutional support, nothing to material comfort, nothing to the approval of the systems that had provided this space as an afterthought, and received, in return, one of the defining scientific achievements of the modern age. There is a particular geometry to triumph when it arrives in grand ceremonial spaces. The high ceilings, the crystal light, the deep red of formal carpeting against pale stone, and a particular geometry to the resistance that shadows it, rendered in the cramped meeting rooms and hostile newspaper offices where institutional conservatism does its quietest and most corrosive work. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, where the Nobel Prize ceremony of 1903 was conducted, represented the architectural language of scientific legitimacy at its most formally assured. The ceremony hall's vaulted ceilings rose to heights that dwarfed the assembled figures beneath them, the stone and plaster of the upper reaches catching, and redistributing the light of crystal chandeliers, whose warm illumination fell downward through the cold air of the Swedish December in long, diffuse columns. The deep red of ceremonial carpeting ran the length of the hall's central axis, its color a deliberate visual anchor against the pale marble of the columns flanking the space. A chromatic decision that encoded the gravity of the occasion and the physical environment itself, the red carrying associations of both honor and solemnity that no other color could have replicated. The 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded jointly to Henry Becquerel and to Pierre and Marie Curie, the first Nobel Prize ever awarded to a woman, a distinction that the Academy's architectural grandeur could not entirely obscure the significance of. The physical environment of the ceremony, the chandeliers, the marble, the ceremonial carpet, was designed to confer legitimacy on achievement already recognized by the international scientific community. Yet the path to this space had run through environments of a very different character, and the resistance that had accompanied the Curie's work remained visible in the institutional landscape surrounding the ceremony's formal splendor. The French Academy of Sciences in Paris occupied a building whose architectural ambitions were, if anything, more elaborate than those of its Stockholm counterpart. The Institut de France on the Quai de Conti presented to the Seine a facade of considerable formal authority, its central dome rising above the surrounding roofline of the left bank, its neoclassical composition asserting the permanence and prestige of the institutions it housed. Inside, the Académie des Sciences conducted its affairs in a meeting room whose ornate decoration, gilded moldings, painted ceilings, the ranked seating of its members arranged in the hierarchical geometry of an institution that took its own precedents seriously, made the physical environment of institutional conservatism legible in every architectural detail. It was in this room, in January 1911, that the French Academy of Sciences voted on Marie Curie's candidacy for membership and rejected it by a margin of 2 votes. The physical environment of that rejection carried its own particular weight. The same gilded moldings, the same painted ceiling, the same ranked seating that had witnessed centuries of French scientific achievement, now containing the moment when that institution chose to exclude the most celebrated scientist in the world on the basis of her gender. The architectural grandeur of the space made the smallness of the decision more rather than less apparent. The contrast between the soaring ambition of the building and the defensive calculation of the vote, a study in the gap between institutional aspiration and institutional reality. The newspaper offices and printing houses of Paris served as the environments where public opinion about Marie Curie was manufactured and distributed, spaces whose physical character was as far from the Academy's gilded meeting room as it was possible to be while remaining within the same city. The compositing rooms of the major Paris dailies were environments of organized industrial noise. The clatter of typesetting equipment, the rhythmic mechanical percussion of the printing presses, the smell of hot metal and printer's ink that permeated every surface of these spaces. Stacked pages of freshly printed newspapers rose in columns along the walls, their ink still carrying the sharp chemical smell of fresh impression. The headlines visible in the bold typefaces that the popular press had developed specifically to command attention at a distance. These spaces produced, in the years surrounding the Nobel Prize ceremonies, a coverage of Marie Curie that oscillated between celebration and hostility with a consistency that reflected less the actual content of her scientific work than the anxieties of a society uncertain how to process a woman of her achievement. The celebratory coverage rendered her as a figure of almost mythological proportions, the Polish immigrant who had conquered French science, the devoted wife and mother who had somehow also managed to discover 2 new elements, the embodiment of feminine virtue elevated by exceptional circumstance to the heights of masculine achievement. The hostile coverage, when it came, was correspondingly vicious. The same newspapers that had celebrated her capable, within the space of a few years, of treating her with a contempt that drew on the deepest reserves of institutional misogyny. the affair with physicist Paul Langevin in 1911, a relationship that developed after Pierre Curie's death between two adults, one of whom was separated from his wife, became the occasion for a press campaign of extraordinary ferocity. The printing houses that had produced celebratory coverage of her Nobel Prize now produced front pages that treated her private life as a public scandal. The same typesetting equipment and the same printing presses generating a different kind of text with the same mechanical efficiency. The physical machinery of public opinion was indifferent to the content it produced. It responded to the market for sensation with the same reliable productivity it brought to the market for scientific news. The blue-white glow that had animated the shed on Rue Vauquelin appeared in these press environments only as metaphor. The luminescence of radioactive discovery rendered in the flat, black and white language of newspaper reproduction, its visual richness compressed into the grey tones of half-tone printing. What had been a phenomenon of extraordinary physical beauty in the darkened shed became, in the pages of the popular press, merely a detail in a story whose real subject was the woman who had discovered it rather than the discovery itself. The streets of Paris in the rain carried their own environmental testimony to the events of these years. The grey Parisian light that had characterized the documentary's Latin Quarter sequences returned here in a different emotional register. Not the neutral, uncommitted grey of a winter day that might become anything, but the particular grey of a day that has already decided what it will be. Rain on the cobblestones of the 5th arrondissement, the reflections of gas lamps broken and scattered by the movement of water across uneven stone, the facades of the buildings along the Rue Vauquelin darkened by moisture to a colour several shades deeper than their dry appearance. It was on such a day, the 4th of April 1906, that Pierre Curie crossed the Rue Dauphine in the rain and was struck by a horse-drawn wagon. He died instantly, his skull fractured by the impact of the vehicle's rear wheel. The physical environment of his death was as ordinary as the shed on Rue Vauquelin had been extraordinary. A wet Paris street, a moment of inattention, the indifferent mechanics of accident. The stone walls of the hospital where his body was taken offered no comfort and no ceremony, their institutional surfaces as neutral and uncommitted as the grey light falling through their windows. The grief that followed was not a private matter contained within domestic spaces. It was a grief that altered the entire environmental register of Marie Curie's world. The laboratory on Rue Vauquelin, the apartment they had shared, the streets of the Latin Quarter through which they had walked together, all of these spaces now carrying the particular weight of absence that transforms familiar environments into records of what they no longer contain. The two chairs at the laboratory workbench, the two sets of equipment, the notebooks written in two distinct hands, these physical details, which had encoded the reality of a scientific partnership of genuine equality, now encoded its ending. The blue-white glow of the radioactive materials in the laboratory continued unchanged. The luminescence that Pierre and Marie had stood together in the darkened shed to observe did not diminish with his absence. It persisted with the indifferent consistency of a physical phenomenon, its beauty unaltered by the human cost that had been paid in its discovery. This persistence, the glow continuing while the partnership that had produced it was broken, was perhaps the most quietly devastating environmental detail of this entire section of the documentary. The light remained. The man who had stood beside her watching it did not. Recognition and resistance, triumph and prejudice, the grand ceremonial spaces of scientific legitimacy, and the cramped, hostile environments of institutional conservatism. These were not sequential experiences for Marie Curie, but simultaneous ones. The architecture of honor and the architecture of exclusion existing in the same city, sometimes in the same week, occasionally in the same day. The crystal chandeliers of Stockholm and the gilded meeting room of the French Academy occupied the same world as the printing, press's manufacturing scandal, and the wet Paris street where a wagon wheel ended a partnership that had changed the understanding of matter itself. The blue-white glow persisted through all of it, shifting in intensity, shifting in color temperature, but never extinguished. the visual signature of a discovery that had already passed beyond the power of any institution, any newspaper, any vote to contain or diminish. There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs exclusively to the Western Front, not the darkness of night or of closed spaces, but the darkness of a landscape so comprehensively destroyed that it seems to have forgotten what light was for. It is into this darkness that Marie Curie carried science, mounted on wheels, powered by generators, guided by the conviction that knowledge deployed in service of human survival was the most urgent work available to a scientist in a world that had chosen to consume itself. The Western Front of 1914 announced itself to the documentary's visual language as a fundamental rupture, not a gradual transition of the kind that had carried the narrative from Warsaw's steel blues to Paris's warmer ochres, but an abrupt environmental transformation that registered as physical shock. The color palette collapsed almost entirely into the muted sepia and mud brown of churned agricultural land. The rich agricultural soils of northern France and Belgium, reduced by months of artillery bombardment and the passage of hundreds of thousands of boots, to a featureless, waterlogged terrain that stretched to flat horizons beneath permanently overcast skies. The visual grammar of the preceding chapters, the architectural detail, the carefully rendered interiors, the quality of light falling through windows onto scientific instruments, gave way to a landscape that had been stripped of everything except its most elemental geological character. Wide establishing shots revealed the full extent of this devastation with an unflinching environmental honesty that the documentary's visual language had been building toward without announcing. Churned mud fields extended in every direction, their surface broken by the geometric regularity of shell craters, filled with standing water that reflected the flat grey sky above them in circles of dull pewter light. Shattered tree trunks stood at intervals across this landscape. The remnants of orchards and woodlands reduced to splintered vertical forms, their bark stripped away by blast and shrapnel to expose the pale wood beneath, their silhouettes against the overcast sky, carrying the particular desolation of living things destroyed before their time. The horizon was defined not by natural topography, but by the accumulated debris of industrial warfare. Broken equipment, collapsed earthworks, the distant geometry of barbed wire entanglements catching what little light the sky offered. The trenches, explored in architectural detail, were environments of extraordinary bleakness, rendered with the same obsessive attention to material reality that had characterized the documentary's treatment of the shed on Rue Vauquelin. Timber-shored walls held back the unstable mud of the trench sides, the wooden planking already warping and splitting under the combined pressure of soil moisture and the vibration of nearby artillery. Duckboard floors lay submerged in standing water that had accumulated through the drainage failures endemic to a landscape whose natural water table had been disrupted by months of bombardment. The boards visible beneath the water's surface as dark geometric forms, their presence more implied than seen. The layered geology of the battlefield was exposed in cross-section along the trench walls. Tops, subsoil, clay, the occasional pale band of chalk that spoke of the deeper geological history of this landscape, now made visible by the violence that had cut down through it. Field hospitals occupied canvas and timber structures positioned at varying distances from the front line. Their interiors rendered in the harsh pragmatics of emergency medicine conducted under impossible conditions. Rough wooden tables served as operating surfaces, their planks scrubbed to a relative cleanliness that the surrounding environment made difficult to maintain. Hanging lanterns provided the primary illumination, their warm, unsteady light falling on the sharp white of bandaging material against the mud brown of military uniforms, on the faces of surgeons working with the focused intensity of people who understood the margin between intervention and death was measured in minutes. The smell of these spaces, antiseptic, blood, the particular organic complexity of traumatic wounds, was implied through surface texture and the visual evidence of the work being conducted within them. It was into this environment that Marie Curie brought the Petites Curies. and the contrast they represented was so visually acute that it registered as something close to the miraculous. The mobile X-ray units that Marie Curie engineered, organized, and deployed during the First World War were, in the most literal sense, a translation of laboratory science into the language of emergency. When the war began in August 1914 and the German advance threatened Paris, the ordinary rhythms of scientific life were suspended with an abruptness that the documentary renders through the visual language of sudden stillness. The laboratory on Rue Vauquelin emptied of its researchers, equipment covered or stored. The blue-white glow of radioactive samples dimmed by the removal of the most precious materials to safety. Marie Curie, transporting her laboratory's gram of radium in a lead-lined container to Bordeaux, where the French government had relocated, depositing it in a bank vault for the duration, a precaution that preserved the irreplaceable material while simultaneously removing from Paris the physical object that had been the center of her scientific life for more than a decade. Her response to the war's demands was not passive, understanding that X-ray technology could dramatically improve the survival rates of wounded soldiers by allowing surgeons to locate embedded shrapnel and assess bone damage before operating. She set about creating a system for delivering this technology to the places where it was most needed, not the fixed hospitals of the rear, but the field surgical units operating close to the front, where the time between wounding and treatment was the critical variable determining survival. The solution she developed was the mobile radiography unit, a vehicle equipped with an X-ray machine, a photographic darkroom for developing the plates, and a generator to provide electrical power, capable of operating wherever a vehicle could reach. The vehicles themselves appeared in the documentary's visual field as remarkable counterpoints to the devastated landscape surrounding them. White-painted automobiles, whose cleanliness and geometric precision stood in sharp visual contrast to the mud and destruction of the Western Front environment. The X-ray equipment mounted within them was rendered with the same attention to period-accurate scientific instrumentation that had characterized the documentary's treatment of the shed on Rue Vauquelin. Glass tubes, copper connections, the precise geometry of a technology that had been, only 2 decades earlier, a laboratory curiosity, and was now a life-saving instrument deployed at the edge of industrial warfare. The sharp white light of the X-ray machines, cutting through the gloom of converted farmhouses and requisitioned schools, carried a visual echo of the blue-white phosphorescent glow of radioactive materials. A different light, produced by different physics, but sharing the same quality of illuminating what had previously been hidden, of making visible what flesh and circumstance had concealed. Marie Curie drove these vehicles herself. She learned to operate the X-ray equipment, to develop the photographic plates, to maintain the generators that powered the machines. She also trained others, eventually establishing a program that produced approximately 150 radiographers who operated the mobile units across multiple theaters of the war. The physical evidence of this training program was visible in the environments where it was conducted. Converted rooms in Paris hospitals, where young women learned to position patients, calibrate equipment, and read the developed plates that showed the shadows of embedded metal against the ghostly outlines of bone and tissue. The environments where the Petites Curies operated were as varied as the geography of the Western Front itself. Converted farmhouses in the Marne Valley, their stone walls thick enough to provide some protection from the vibration of nearby artillery. Their interiors reorganized around the practical requirements of radiographic examination, the X-ray table positioned for maximum accessibility, the darkroom established in whatever space offered the necessary light exclusion, the generator positioned outside to reduce noise and exhaust fumes within the working area. Requisitioned schools whose classrooms had been emptied of their ordinary furniture and refitted as surgical theaters, the children's drawings still visible on the walls above the operating tables. Village churches transformed into medical spaces, their stone floors bearing the weight of equipment that their architects could not have imagined, their high windows admitting the flat grey light of the Western Front's permanently overcast sky. The X-ray plates produced in these spaces were objects of extraordinary visual power, developed images in which the familiar visual grammar of the human body was rendered in the negative language of radiographic exposure, the dense structures of bone appearing as pale forms against the darker tones of surrounding tissue, and within that landscape, the precise geometric shadows of embedded shrapnel. Small, irregular metallic forms whose exact location and orientation could now be determined before a surgeon made the first incision. These plates represented, in the most direct possible form, the translation of scientific knowledge into human survival. The abstract physics of X-ray penetration made concrete in the image of a fragment of metal, located precisely enough that a surgeon could remove it without causing additional damage. Marie Curie attempted, in the war's early months, to donate the gold medals from her 2 Nobel Prizes to support the French war effort, an offer that the authorities declined, recognizing perhaps that the symbolic value of the medals exceeded their material worth. She purchased war bonds instead, directing her financial resources toward the conflict with the same directness she brought to every other aspect of her wartime engagement. The gram of radium remained in its Bordeaux vault throughout the war, its blue-white glow contained and preserved against the day when the conflict would end and the work of peacetime science could resume. The cost of the wartime work was not immediately visible in the environments of the Western Front. The petites Curies operated with the efficiency of well-designed systems, their white vehicles moving through the devastated landscape with a purposefulness that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding them. But the X-ray equipment that Marie Curie operated and maintained throughout the war years exposed her to radiation levels that would only later be understood as significant. Not the alpha and beta radiation of the radioactive materials she had worked with for decades, but the penetrating X-ray radiation whose biological effects were, in the early years of the war, even less well understood than the effects of radioactivity itself. She later wrote one of the first practical texts on radiology in wartime and on safety at the bedside, a document that encoded, in its careful attention to protective measures, the hard-won understanding of someone who had learned the costs of insufficient caution through direct experience. The Western Front sequences close on an image that carries the full weight of the documentary's central visual motif, transformed by context into something both familiar and new. A petite Curie parked outside a converted farmhouse in the fading light of a late afternoon, its white paint darkened by the mud of the roads it has traveled, the generator running quietly beside it. Through the farmhouse window, the sharp white light of the X-ray machine is visible, cutting through the gloom of the interior, illuminating the hidden damage within a human body, making visible what could not otherwise be seen. It is not the blue-white phosphorescent glow of radium in a darkened shed, but it carries the same essential quality, the quality of a light that reveals, that makes knowledge possible where ignorance would otherwise prevail, that transforms the relationship between what is known and what can be done. The mud of the Western Front surrounds it on every side. The light persists. There is a particular quality to recognition that arrives a second time, not the shock of the first, not the disorientation of suddenly finding oneself standing in the light after years of working in its absence, but something more complex and more ambivalent. The confirmation that the first recognition was not an anomaly, that the work has continued to justify the attention, that the light, once acknowledged, has not diminished. By 1911, the laboratory environments of Marie Curie's Paris had undergone the incremental improvements that accompany growing institutional recognition, without yet achieving the purpose-built adequacy that recognition ultimately demands. The spaces she worked in during this period bore the visual evidence of modest but meaningful change, slightly better ventilation than the shed en rue Vauquelin had offered, the acrid chemical vapors of the processing work now partially drawn away by ducting that had been added to the structure's original inadequate design. The glassware on the workbenches was more sophisticated, the instruments more precisely calibrated. the equipment reflecting a decade of accumulated scientific refinement rather than the improvised resourcefulness of the earliest years. A small office space had been added adjacent to the main laboratory, a room barely large enough for a desk and a chair, its window overlooking the courtyard where the pitchblende processing had once filled the air with chemical haze. Now quiet and ordered, the iron cauldrons gone, the space returned to something approaching ordinary urban calm. The notebooks on that desk were dense with the record of years of work directed toward a single precise goal: the isolation of pure radium metal in quantities sufficient for exact atomic weight determination. The earlier work, the identification of polonium in July 1898, the announcement of radium's existence in December of the same year, had established the element's presence without yet delivering the pure samples that chemistry required for complete characterization. The atomic weight that Marie Curie had calculated from her processed samples was approximately 225, a figure that placed radium definitively in the periodic table's second column, alongside barium, calcium, and the other alkaline earth metals. But the scientific community's full acceptance of radium as a genuine element required the isolation of pure radium metal, the actual substance, separated from all chemical compounds, its physical properties directly measurable. This isolation was achieved in 1910 in collaboration with chemist André-Louis Debian, a process that required the electrolysis of radium chloride solution using a mercury cathode. The resulting radium amalgam then heated to drive off the mercury and leave behind a small quantity of pure radium metal. The quantity was extraordinarily small by any conventional measure, a fraction of a gram, barely visible to the naked eye, its existence confirmed by the instruments rather than by direct observation. Yet this fraction was sufficient. The atomic weight determination it enabled, 226.0, a figure that remains accurate to modern measurement, provided the definitive chemical characterization that the Nobel Committee recognized in awarding the 1911 prize in chemistry. The pure radium samples of this period occupied sealed glass vessels whose visual character was fundamentally different from the diffuse luminescence of the earlier processing stages, where the shed en Rue Vauquelin had glowed with the distributed atmospheric blue-white light of partially purified radioactive fractions spread across dozens of vessels. The pure samples of 1910 and 1911 emitted a light that was steady, precise, and concentrated, a luminescence whose quality reflected the purity of its source, the glow of a material that had been separated from everything that was not itself. The color temperature of this light was subtly cooler than the warmer blue-white of the earlier stages, its intensity more controlled, its edges more defined. It was the light of a phenomenon understood rather than merely observed, the visual expression of scientific knowledge that had advanced from discovery to characterization. The Stockholm ceremony of December 1911 returned the documentary's visual language to the architectural environments of formal recognition. The same Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences Hall, whose crystal chandeliers and deep red ceremonial carpeting had framed the 1903 Physics Prize ceremony. But the light fell differently now. 8 years had passed between the two ceremonies, years that had included Pierre's death, the rejection by the French Academy of Sciences, the scandal manufactured by the Paris press, and the continued scientific work that had produced the isolation of pure radium metal. The chandeliers cast the same warm illumination downward through the cold Swedish December air. But the shadows in the hall were deeper and more complex than they had been in 1903. The architectural space unchanged, the emotional register of the occasion carrying a weight that the earlier ceremony had not required it to bear. The 1911 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Marie Curie alone, not shared, as the Physics Prize had been, but hers entirely, in recognition of her services to the advancement of chemistry through the discovery of radium and polonium, the isolation of radium, and the study of the nature and compounds of this remarkable element. She was, at that moment, the only person in history to have won 2 Nobel Prizes in different scientific fields, a distinction that the Academy's citation rendered in the formal language of institutional recognition, but that the physical environment of the ceremony hall encoded in more immediate terms. The single figure at the center of the ceremonial space, the chandeliers illuminating a solitary achievement rather than a shared one, the deep red carpet leading to a podium that she reached without the partnership that had defined the first ceremony. The Institut du Radium, whose construction had been authorized in 1909 through a joint initiative of the Institut Pasteur and the University of Paris, was nearing completion during the period of the second Nobel Prize. A building whose existence represented the institutionalization of radioactivity as a recognized field of scientific inquiry with its own dedicated research infrastructure. The building on what would eventually become the Rue Pierre et Marie Curie occupied a site in the Latin Quarter whose proximity to the Sorbonne encoded its relationship to the broader geography of Parisian scientific life. Its architecture was deliberately modern in character, a clean, functional building whose design prioritized scientific utility over architectural. Display its facade modest by the standards of the grand institutional buildings that surrounded it, but possessed of a quiet dignity that spoke of serious purpose rather than ceremonial ambition. The contrast between this building and the shed on Rue Vauquelin was the documentary's most explicit architectural argument. The distance between the two spaces measuring not merely the physical improvement in working conditions, but the transformation in the institutional status of the science conducted within them. The shed had been offered as an afterthought, a space with no better use, its inadequacy a physical expression of the institution's indifference to the work it housed. The Institut du Radium was purpose-built, its spaces designed around the specific requirements of radioactivity research, its construction funded by institutions that had recognized, belatedly, imperfectly, but genuinely, that the work being conducted in inadequate spaces deserved better. Yet the blue-white glow that animated both spaces was the same glow. The luminescence that had first appeared in the darkened shed as a phenomenon of extraordinary, unexpected beauty. The soft light of dozens of partially purified vessels reflecting off a glass roof and chemical-stained workbenches persisted in the Institut du Radium's more ordered spaces as a presence both more controlled and no less remarkable. Pure samples in sealed vessels, their light steady and precise, occupied the new laboratory's shelves with the contained authority of phenomena that had been characterized, measured, and understood without being diminished. The glow had moved from the crude to the refined, from the improvised to the institutional, from the shed's atmospheric luminescence to the laboratory's precise containment. But it remained, fundamentally, the same light, the same force made visible by the same physical process, carrying within it the same ambivalence that had characterized it from the first night Marie Curie had stood in the darkened shed and watched it fill the space around her. The second Nobel Prize secured a legacy that the first had initiated. It confirmed that the work of the shed on Rue Vauquelin had not been a single extraordinary event, but the foundation of a sustained scientific program. That the mind that had isolated polonium and radium in conditions of deliberate institutional neglect was capable of continuing to advance the understanding of radioactive phenomena across decades of work. The small office adjacent to the improved laboratory, the sophisticated glassware on the workbenches, the pure samples glowing steadily in their sealed vessels. These were the physical environments of a scientist at the height of her powers, working in spaces that had finally, if still imperfectly, begun to reflect the scale of what she had achieved within them. There is a particular kind of arrival that can only be understood against the full weight of everything that preceded it. The arrival not merely at a place, but at a condition of possibility that years of inadequate spaces and institutional indifference had made seem perpetually deferred. When Marie Curie first walked through the entrance of the Institut du Radium on the Rue Pierre et Marie Curie in the summer of 1914, she was entering a building that represented something the shed on Rue Vauquelin had never been. a space built specifically for her science, for the work that had already changed the understanding of matter itself. The building's exterior presented to its Latin Quarter Street a facade of modest, but considered architectural dignity, neoclassical in its organizing principles, without being ostentatious in their application. The stone of its front elevation, weathering almost immediately into the characteristic pale grey of Parisian limestone. Its proportions calibrated to the scale of the surrounding streetscape, rather than asserting the institutional grandeur of the Sorbonne or the Academy. It was a building that announced serious purpose without theatrical display, its architectural restraint a deliberate choice that reflected the values of the scientist for whom it had been designed, a woman constitutionally resistant to self-promotion, who had spent her career demonstrating that the quality of the work was the only credential that mattered. The entrance hall received visitors onto polished stone floors, whose surface carried the particular cool luminosity of well-maintained limestone, a material that absorbed and redistributed light with a quality subtly different from the chemical-stained wooden surfaces of the shed's workbenches or the worn academic wood of the Sorbonne's lecture halls. The light entering through the entrance hall's windows fell on these floors at angles that shifted through the day as the sun moved across the Latin Quarter's roofline, the morning light arriving from the east with a directional clarity that gave way by afternoon to the more diffuse illumination of a sky whose direct solar angle had moved beyond the building's window orientation. These were not the dramatic light effects of the ceremonial spaces of Stockholm or the Academy. They were the quieter, more functional illumination of a space designed for work rather than display. The main research laboratory occupied the building's primary ground floor space, a room whose dimensions had been determined not by architectural convention, but by the practical requirements of radioactivity research conducted at the scale that the Institute's ambitions demanded. Ordered rows of workbenches ran the length of the space, their surfaces equipped with the most advanced instrumentation available in the early decades of the 20th century. Electrometers of refined design, glassware of precisely calibrated volume and chemical resistance, the copper and glass apparatus of distillation and crystallization processes that had been refined through years of practice in the shed on Rue Vauquelin into their most efficient forms. The organization of these surfaces reflected the working habits of a scientist of extraordinary precision. The ordered chaos of a disciplined mind, instruments positioned for efficiency of movement between them, notebooks open to densely written pages at the exact point where the current experimental sequence had been interrupted. The blue-white phosphorescent glow of radioactive materials permeated these spaces differently than it had the shed. In the Institut du Radium's purpose-built laboratories, the glow was contained, present in sealed vessels positioned at designated locations on the workbenches, its light steady and controlled rather than the atmospheric, distributed luminescence that had filled the shed's entire interior on those extraordinary evenings when Maria Curie and Pierre had stood in the darkness, watching the accumulated glow of dozens of partially purified samples. Here, the light was studied rather than simply witnessed. It occupied its designated position in the experimental apparatus, its intensity measured by instruments calibrated for precisely that purpose, its behavior recorded in the notebooks with the methodical completeness that had characterized every stage of the work since the earliest days of the shed. Yet the glow's emotional resonance was not diminished by its containment. If anything, the contrast between the controlled, institutional environment of the Institute and the raw, atmospheric luminescence of the shed made the light's presence in these more ordered spaces more rather than less significant. A reminder that the phenomenon being studied here had first revealed itself in conditions of deliberate inadequacy, that the blue-white light, now contained in sealed vessels and measured by sophisticated instruments, had once filled a leaking wooden shed with a beauty that no institutional space could have anticipated or designed. The color temperature of the glow in the Institute's laboratories was subtly warmer than it had appeared in the shed's cold winter air, the controlled temperature of the purpose-built space, the absence of the frost that had characterized the shed's winter working conditions, giving the light a slightly different quality that registered as comfort rather than the austere wonder of those earlier observations. The specialized rooms for radioactive sample preparation occupied spaces whose design reflected the accumulated practical knowledge of years of work, with materials whose behavior under various chemical and physical conditions had been learned through direct experience rather than theoretical prediction. Ventilation systems drew chemical vapors away from the working surfaces with an efficiency that the shed's complete absence of ventilation had never approached. Storage arrangements for radioactive samples followed protocols that encoded, in their physical organization, an understanding of radiation's behavior that had been developed through the work itself. The distances maintained between samples, the shielding materials interposed between storage locations and working areas, the systematic record keeping that tracked the location and activity of every significant quantity of radioactive material in the building. A small garden at the building's rear provided the Institut du Radium with something the shed on Rue Vauquelin had never possessed: a transition space between the interior world of scientific work and the broader world of the Latin Quarter beyond the building's walls. This garden, modest in scale and deliberately functional in its planting, served as the physical boundary between the controlled environment of the laboratory and the uncontrolled environment of the city. Marie Curie was photographed in this garden on multiple occasions, the images conveying a figure of modest physical stature whose presence in the space carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to working in environments fitted to precise, focused movement, the garden's scale appropriate to a person who had spent decades at laboratory workbenches designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The Institut's relationship to its urban environment was inseparable from its meaning. Its position in the Latin Quarter, the same quarter that had received Maria Skłodowska as a student in 1891, the same streets where she had lived in the garret rooms and walked between the Sorbonne's lecture halls and the inadequate shed on Rue Vauquelin, encoded a continuity of place that the building's existence made architecturally legible. The Sorbonne's dome was visible from certain angles above the Institut's roofline. The proximity of the two institutions, a physical expression of the relationship between the university that had educated her and the research institute that her work had made necessary. The narrow medieval streets of the 5th arrondissement surrounded the building on every side, their cobblestones carrying the same foot traffic they had carried for centuries, their facades unchanged by the extraordinary scientific work being conducted behind the Institut's modest limestone front. The building had been conceived as two adjacent structures: the Curie Laboratory for fundamental radioactivity research and the Pasteur Laboratory for biological and medical research into the applications of radioactive materials in treating disease. This dual organization encoded in architectural form the understanding that had been developing since the earliest days of radium research, that the phenomenon discovered in the shed on Rue Vauquelin had implications not only for physics and chemistry, but for medicine, that the blue-white glow of radioactive materials carried within it both the light of fundamental scientific knowledge and the more immediately practical light of potential therapeutic application. The two laboratories shared a building, but maintained their distinct research programs, a physical arrangement that reflected the productive tension between pure and applied science that had characterized the field since its origins. The Institut du Radium opened formally in 1914, weeks before the outbreak of the First World War interrupted its operations almost immediately. The building emptied of its researchers as the German advance threatened Paris, the most precious radioactive materials removed to safety, the purpose-built spaces standing temporarily vacant in the summer heat. The irony of this timing, a building decades in the making, finally completed and then immediately suspended, was rendered in the documentary's visual language through the particular quality of light in empty laboratory spaces. The ordered rows of workbenches still equipped, the notebooks still open, the sealed vessels of radioactive material removed from their positions, but the spaces they had occupied still faintly luminescent with the residual glow that radioactive contamination leaves in surfaces long exposed to it. When the war ended and the Institute's work resumed, it did so in the full knowledge of what the intervening years had cost and what they had demonstrated. The Petites Curies had shown that the science developed in the shed on Rue Vauquelin and refined in the Institute's purpose-built laboratories could be translated into direct human benefit under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The building that received Marie Curie back from the wartime work was the same building she had entered in 1914. Its polished stone floors, its ordered workbenches, its contained blue-white glow. But the scientist who returned to it carried the additional weight of years spent deploying science in the service of survival, of watching X-ray light cut through the darkness of field hospitals to reveal the hidden damage within human bodies. The Institut du Radium was, in the end, what the shed on Rue Vauquelin had never been allowed to be. A space that matched the scale of the work conducted within it, that provided the material conditions for science to proceed without the constant friction of inadequate facilities, that encoded in its architecture the institutional acknowledgement that the work deserved. The blue-white glow that animated its laboratories was the same glow that had first appeared in the darkened shed. The same phenomenon, the same physics, the same ambivalent beauty. But here it was received into a space that had been built to contain it, to study it, to understand it more completely than the shed's leaking roof and mud floor had ever permitted. The temple, at last, was worthy of the light it housed. There is a particular cruelty in the fact that the light which made Marie Curie's greatest achievements visible was simultaneously, invisibly, consuming her. That the blue-white phosphorescent glow she had first witnessed in the darkened shed on Rue Vauquelin, the luminescence she had stood in darkness to observe with wonder and something approaching reverence, was the outward expression of a force working steadily against the biological integrity of the body that had discovered it. The health consequences of decades of unprotected work with radioactive materials accumulated slowly, invisibly, in the manner of all the most consequential processes, not as dramatic events, but as gradual deteriorations, the body's systems failing incrementally in ways that medicine in the early 20th century was only beginning to understand and could not yet adequately treat. Marie Curie suffered from chronic fatigue, from cataracts that progressively dimmed her vision, from kidney disease, from the bone marrow failure that would ultimately prove fatal. Her fingers were permanently scarred from years of direct contact with radioactive substances. Her notebooks, as noted earlier, remain radioactive to this day. The physical record of a scientific life, conducted in intimate proximity to forces whose biological costs were not yet legible to the people most exposed to them. The environments associated with the long arc of this illness were not the dramatic spaces of acute medical crisis, but the quieter, more sustained spaces of treatment sought and recovery, attempted, the sanatoriums of the French Alps, the spa towns of Central Europe, the domestic interiors of a life increasingly organized around the management of physical limitation. These spaces constitute a chapter in Marie Curie's story that her characteristic reticence about personal matters made difficult for contemporaries to fully perceive, and that the documentary renders not through medical imagery, but through the architectural and environmental character of the places where endurance was practiced. The Alpine sanatoriums that Marie Curie visited during the later decades of her life occupied a distinctive architectural niche in the medical geography of early 20th century Europe. The sanatorium movement, which had developed primarily in response to the tuberculosis epidemic of the 19th century, had established in the mountain regions of France, Switzerland, and Austria a characteristic building type whose design principles were organized around the therapeutic properties attributed to high-altitude air, sunlight, and physical rest. These buildings presented to the mountain landscape long wooden balconies facing south toward the peaks, extended outdoor spaces where patients could recline in the carefully managed natural light of high altitude. the sun's angle and intensity at elevation offering a quality of illumination unavailable in the lowland cities, where most of these patients ordinarily lived. The interiors of these sanatoriums were white-painted spaces flooded with carefully managed natural light. The whiteness of the walls and ceilings, a deliberate therapeutic choice, the color of cleanliness and clarity, the visual environment of a space designed to counteract the darkness and confinement associated with illness in urban settings. The light entering through the large south-facing windows of the patient rooms fell on these white surfaces with a directness and intensity that the overcast skies of Paris and Warsaw had never produced. A light that was simultaneously warmer in color temperature and more precise in its directionality than the flat gray illumination that had characterized the documentary's earlier environments. The color palette of these alpine sequences represented the most deliberate visual departure in the entire documentary. Brighter, more saturated, the deep blues of high-altitude sky and the brilliant whites of snow-covered peaks offering a visual respite from the darker, more constrained tones of laboratory and battlefield that had dominated the preceding chapters. The mountains themselves appeared as presences of considerable environmental authority. The Hortsavy peaks visible from the sanatorium balconies, their upper slopes carrying the permanent snow that gave them their characteristic visual weight, their lower flanks covered in the dark green of coniferous forest that provided a middle register between the white of the peaks and the warmer tones of the valley below. Yet even in these spaces of deliberate brightness and therapeutic calm, the blue-white glow of radioactive materials persisted as a visual memory, not as a literal presence, for the radioactive samples were far away in their sealed vessels, in the Institut du Radium's specialized storage rooms, but as a quality of light that certain conditions evoked with an insistence that the documentary renders as the visual signature of an inseparable connection between achievement and cost. The phosphorescent shimmer of snow under moonlight on the alpine slopes visible from the sanatorium windows carried, in its blue-white quality, an echo of the glow that had first appeared in the darkened shed decades earlier. The particular luminescence of frost on the balcony railings in the early morning, before the sun had risen. The eastern peaks shared a color temperature with the light of radium samples in sealed glass vessels. These visual rhymes were not coincidental. They were the documentary's most subtle and persistent argument that the cost and the achievement were not separable phenomena, but aspects of a single reality, the light and its consequences inseparable from the moment of their first appearance. The spa towns of Central Europe, Bad Gastein in Austria, Franzensbad in Bohemia, the various mineral spring resorts of the German and Czech borderlands offered a different environmental register for the management of illness. These were not the austere, medically organized spaces of the Alpine sanatoriums, but the more socially complex environments of the European leisure and health culture that had developed around natural mineral springs across several centuries. Their architecture reflected this complexity. Grand hotels, whose facades bore the ornamental confidence of the Belle Époque, pump rooms and bathing establishments, whose interior design combined medical function with the social expectations of a clientele that included both the genuinely ill and the fashionably unwell. Promenades and gardens, whose careful landscaping provided the physical environment for the slow, prescribed walking that formed part of the therapeutic regime. Marie Curie's visits to these environments were not primarily social occasions. She came for the treatments, the mineral baths, the rest, the distance from the laboratory and its demands, and she brought with her the same disciplined attention to the task at hand that she brought to every other aspect of her life. The spa town environments appear in the documentary's visual language as spaces of ambivalent beauty. Their architectural elegance and carefully maintained gardens offering genuine aesthetic pleasure, their social character as places of leisure and display standing in deliberate contrast to the working environments that had defined most of her adult life. The domestic spaces of Marie Curie's later years, the apartment in Paris, the small house in Sceaux where she lived with her daughters, the garden that she tended with the same methodical attention she brought to laboratory work, were environments of a life increasingly organized around the management of physical limitation without surrender to it. The laboratory notebooks continued to accumulate dense pages of experimental records. The correspondence with scientists across Europe and beyond continued to fill the desk in the small study. The Institut du Radium continued to operate under her direction, its research programs advancing along the lines she had established. The blue-white glow of its radioactive samples contained and studied in the purpose-built spaces she had worked for decades to create. The visual character of these domestic spaces reflected the same qualities that had defined every environment associated with Marie Curie. The organized precision of a disciplined scientific mind, the absence of decorative excess, the practical arrangement of objects according to function rather than display. A simple coat hung by the door, worn gloves on the laboratory bench, the physical evidence of a life conducted at the margin of material comfort by choice rather than necessity. The Nobel Prize money directed towards scientific equipment and the education of others rather than toward personal comfort. The domestic environment reflecting the same ascetic priorities that had characterized the garret rooms of the Latin Quarter student years. The cataracts that progressively clouded her vision in the final decade of her life introduced a particular irony into the story of a scientist whose work had been so fundamentally concerned with light, with the luminescence of radioactive materials, with the X-ray light that penetrated flesh to reveal hidden damage, with the quality of illumination in every laboratory and lecture hall and ceremonial space through which her career had moved. The world was becoming literally darker for her, even as the scientific understanding she had helped create was illuminating aspects of matter and energy that had never previously been visible. She underwent multiple operations to address the cataracts, wearing thick glasses in her later years, the lenses necessary to bring into focus a world that her damaged eyes could no longer resolve unaided. Marie Curie died on the 4th of July, 1934, at the Sanselemos Sanatorium in the Hochsave, one of those alpine spaces whose long south-facing balconies and white-painted interiors had provided the environmental backdrop for the later stages of her illness. The diagnosis recorded was aplastic anemia, a failure of the bone marrow to produce adequate blood cells, a condition that her physicians attributed to her decades of exposure to radiation. The cumulative biological cost of the blue-white light finally rendered in the language of cellular failure. She was 66 years old. The sanatorium at Sanselemos occupied its position in the alpine landscape with the characteristic architectural confidence of the type. The long balconies facing the southern peaks, the white walls catching the mountain light at angles that the lowland cities never produced, the crisp, high-altitude air implied through the visual clarity of the mountain environment visible from every window. On the morning of her death, the documentary renders the space in the particular quality of alpine summer light, bright, precise, the shadows sharp-edged in the thin mountain air, the snow on the distant peaks carrying its characteristic blue-white luminescence in the early morning before the sun had fully risen above the eastern ridgeline. The blue-white glow that had threaded through every environment in the documentary, first glimpsed in the darkened shed on Rue Vauquelin as a phenomenon of extraordinary, unexpected beauty, then refined through the Institut du Radium's purpose-built laboratories into a controlled and studied presence, then echoed in the sharp white light of the Petites Curies cutting through the darkness of Western Front field hospitals, appeared here in its final form. The phosphorescent shimmer of alpine snow under the early morning light, the blue-white quality of a mountain dawn, the luminescence of a world that continued to glow with the same physical processes that had first revealed themselves to a scientist standing in a darkened shed, watching in wonder as the light she had spent her life pursuing filled the space around her with its ambivalent, consuming, irreplaceable beauty. Some lights once kindled cannot be extinguished by the death of the hand that first struck the flame. They pass instead into the architecture of the world, into stone and institution, into the habits of scientific practice, into the physical spaces where the work continues long after the person who began it has gone. The legacy of Marie Curie exists in precisely this form, not as memory alone, but as living infrastructure, as buildings still occupied by researchers who do not know her face, but work within the conditions her achievement made possible. The Institut Curie on the Rue Pierre Curie in Paris presents to its Latin Quarter Street a facade that has changed relatively little since the building's original construction in the years before the First World War. The pale limestone of its exterior has weathered through more than a century of Parisian seasons into the characteristic grey of the city's older institutional buildings. The same grey that defines the Sorbonne's facade, the same grey that characterizes the walls of the Bibliothèque Nationale, the grey of a city that absorbs time into its surfaces without announcing the fact. But behind this facade, the building's interior has been transformed repeatedly by the expanding demands of cancer research, a field whose existence as a systematic scientific enterprise owes more to Marie Curie's work on radioactivity than to any other single source. The contemporary Institut Curie is one of Europe's leading cancer research and treatment centers. Its modern facilities, extending far beyond the original building's footprint into adjacent structures that have been added across successive decades of institutional growth. The research laboratories of the current Institut bear no visual resemblance to the ordered workbenches and sealed glass vessels of Marie Curie's working environment. They are spaces of contemporary biomedical science, equipped with instruments whose operating principles she would have recognized, but whose sophistication would have exceeded anything available during her lifetime. Yet the continuity between these spaces and the original Institut du Radium is not merely institutional or historical. It is physical and functional. The understanding that radioactive materials could be deployed therapeutically against cancerous tissue, an understanding that Marie Curie grasped early and worked to develop throughout her career, is the direct scientific ancestor of the radiation therapy techniques practiced in the Institut's clinical facilities today. The blue-white glow that has threaded through every environment in this documentary appears in the contemporary Institut's spaces in a form that Marie Curie would have found simultaneously familiar and transformed. The radioactive materials used in modern cancer treatment are handled in shielded facilities whose protective engineering reflects a century of accumulated understanding of radiation's biological effects. Understanding that was purchased, in part, at the cost of the health of the scientists who first worked with these materials without adequate protection. The glow is still present, still the visual signature of the same physical processes that first revealed themselves in the darkened shed on Rue Vauquelin, but it is received now into spaces, designed specifically to contain it, to direct it, to deploy its energy with a precision that the early researchers could not have achieved and could barely have imagined. The University of Warsaw's physics and chemistry departments occupy spaces whose relationship to Marie Curie's influence is legible in both institutional and architectural terms. The university that denied admission to women during the years of Russian occupation. The institution whose exclusionary policies had driven Maria Skłodowska toward the floating university's hidden classrooms and eventually toward Paris, has long since transformed itself into a major research university whose scientific faculties bear the mark of the intellectual tradition she helped establish. The physics laboratories of the contemporary university contain equipment and pursue research programs that exist in direct intellectual continuity with the work she conducted in Paris. The scientific questions she opened remaining productive areas of inquiry more than a century after she first formulated them. Warsaw itself has been transformed beyond recognition from the city of cold steel blues and Russian imperial authority that shaped Maria Skłodowska's early intellectual life. The cobblestone streets of the old city have been reconstructed after the near-total destruction of the Second World War, their surfaces carrying the particular quality of deliberate historical reconstruction rather than organic historical accumulation. A city rebuilt from memory and documentation, the physical environment of the past, restored through the effort of a people who understood, as the floating university's organizers had understood, that the preservation of cultural inheritance against the forces of destruction was itself a form of resistance. In these reconstructed streets, the memory of the clandestine educational network that first shaped Marie Curie's scientific imagination is preserved not in physical continuity, but in the institutional culture of a scientific community that traces its lineage, in part, to the hidden classrooms of the Russian occupation period. The Pantheon in Paris, that vast neoclassical monument on the left bank, whose dome rises above the Latin Quarter's roofline as one of the city's most recognizable architectural presences, received Marie Curie's remains in 1995, when the French state transferred her coffin and that of Pierre Curie to the building's crypt in a ceremony that acknowledged, belatedly, and with the particular weight of 60 years of retrospective recognition, the scale of what she had contributed to human knowledge. She became the first woman to be interred in the Pantheon on the basis of her own achievements, a distinction whose significance was rendered in architectural terms by the building itself, whose interior spaces are among the most formally imposing in France. The Pantheon's interior is a space of extraordinary architectural ambition, the vast nave rising to heights that dwarf the individual human figure, the high windows admitting the particular quality of light that filters through tall glass into a space designed to receive it with maximum effect. This light diffuse, even falling from multiple directions through the building's high windows, has a quality unlike any of the other illuminated spaces that have appeared in this documentary. It is not the flat grey of Parisian winter days filtering through the Sorbonne's lecture hall windows, not the warm amber of gas lamps in Warsaw's hidden classrooms, not the sharp white of X-ray machines in Western front field hospitals. It is something more formal and more deliberate, the light of a space designed to confer permanent significance on what it contains, to render the ordinary dimensions of human achievement legible against the scale of historical time. The crypt below the Pantheon's main floor receives this light in attenuated form, the stone staircase descending from the nave's brightness into the cooler, more subdued illumination of the underground space where the sarcophagi of France's honored dead are arranged in the particular silence of enclosed stone. The sarcophagus containing Marie Curie's remains occupies its position in this space with the same modest dignity that characterized every environment associated with her, not the largest or most ornate of the crypt's monuments, but present with a permanence that the building's stone and the institution's authority combine to guarantee. The lead lining of the coffin, necessary because the radioactive contamination of her remains and personal effects remains measurable to this day, is invisible within the stone sarcophagus, but its presence encodes, in the most literal possible form, the inseparability of the achievement and its cost. The documentary's closing movement returns, as all genuine conclusions must, to its beginning, to the environments of its opening sequences, revisited now in the full knowledge of everything that has passed through them. The cobblestone streets of Warsaw under winter skies appear again in the documentary's final sequences, their surfaces slicked with the same autumn rain that characterized the opening images, the gas lamps casting their narrow amber halos into the same fog rolling in from the Vistula. But the visual register of these familiar surfaces has shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably. The cold steel blues that define the opening sequences have been warmed, almost beyond the threshold of conscious perception, by the persistent, ambient blue-white glow that has threaded through every environment in the film. The shed on Rue Vauquelin, or its commemorative reconstruction, the physical space preserved as a site of historical memory, appears in these closing sequences in the particular quality of light that falls through its glass roof panels in the late afternoon, the sun's angle producing long shadows across the chemical-stained workbenches, the empty vessels on the shelves catching and redistributing the light in small, scattered reflections. The space is empty of researchers. empty of the iron cauldrons and pitchblende ore that once filled its courtyard, empty of the two figures who once stood in its darkness, watching the blue-white glow fill the space around them. But the glow persists, not as a literal luminescence in the empty space, but as a quality of the light itself, the particular blue-white temperature of the afternoon sun filtered through the glass roof panels, carrying the visual memory of the phenomenon first witnessed here more than a century ago. The lecture halls of the Sorbonne received the documentary's final images with the same flat grey winter light that has characterized them throughout. The tiered wooden benches worn smooth by generations of students, the tall arched windows admitting the neutral illumination of a Parisian winter day, the blackboards bearing their dense mathematical notation. But the light falling through these windows carries, in the documentary's closing visual register, a warmth that the opening sequences did not possess, the accumulated warmth of a story that has moved through darkness and discovery, through triumph and cost, through the grand ceremonial spaces of recognition and the cramped environments of institutional resistance, and arrived finally at the understanding that the light kindled in a leaking shed in the Latin Quarter has never, in all the decades since, gone out. The blue-white glow, first glimpsed as a scientific curiosity in the darkened shed, then recognized as a symbol of discovery in the Nobel ceremony halls, then rendered as an ambivalent reminder of achievement and cost in the Alpine sanatoriums, appears in the documentary's final image in its most essential form. Not in a laboratory vessel, not in a ceremonial space, not in the phosphorescent shimmer of mountain snow, but in the quality of light itself, diffused through the stone and glass of the institutions that Marie Curie's work made possible, present in every space where the pursuit of scientific truth continues in the conditions of possibility that her extraordinary, costly, irreplaceable life helped create.